Let's examine some of the cognitive biases that impede credibility assessment. First, what is a cognitive bias? It's a distortion in the way that we perceive reality that leads us to erroneous conclusions. Sometimes they're caused by an overuse of heuristics, which are mental shortcuts that we use to make quick decisions. I'll give you an example. When you go to a grocery store and you're shopping for laundry detergent, you're faced with too many choices. So how do you choose? If you stop to read the labels and the ingredients of every option, that would be a systematic approach and would eliminate bias. But who has time for that? Instead, you might use a heuristic like, I buy the same brand every time, or I buy the cheapest brand, or I buy the brand my mom used to buy. Heuristics save us time, but can lead us to costly mistakes if we miss out on good options that we don't consider. Overuse of heuristics can lead to bias or erroneous conclusions. Shelley Shakin, in her heuristic systematic model of information processing, says that in order to use systematic thinking instead of heuristics, we need both motivation and the ability to use systematic processing. Ability means we need skills and the time to do so. So if you want to avoid these biases, you need to be motivated to detect deception accurately, which you probably are or you wouldn't be taking this course. You also need the skills to detect accurately, also learned in this course. You need to give yourself time to think systematically, and you need to be aware of your own biases so you can try to avoid the pitfalls associated with them. There are many different types of cognitive bias, but there are 6 biases I would like to discuss with you today. They all cause faulty reasoning and prevent us from making accurate veracity judgments. They are the truth bias, and its opposite, the lie bias, the visual bias, the demeanor bias, the expectancy violations bias, confirmation bias, and representativeness bias. First, let's talk about the truth bias. This is the tendency to overestimate other people's truthfulness. You could think of it as a truthfulness heuristic, as an a priori belief, expectation, or presumption that reflects the tendency to assume communicators are truthful most of the time. It becomes a bias when it results in an overestimate of actual number of truths relative to the base rate of actual truthfulness. A lie bias reflects an underestimate of the same. The fact that people are better at detecting truths than lies is evidence of the truth bias, because guessing truth is the default. If, in certain professions, you encounter more lies than the average person, you could imagine how a lie bias could develop. I worked in a collection office once, and after you hear the check's in the mail about 100 times with no check arriving, you assume it's always a lie. The second bias is called the visual bias. It's the tendency to place more reliance on visual than vocal, linguistic, or other forms of social information. We rely on visual cues the most, even though they are often the least diagnostic in identifying deception. This is because of the visual primacy effect. If the nonverbal and verbal parts of a message are inconsistent with one another, we tend to trust the nonverbal over the verbal part. Humans are hardwired to read faces, especially so when someone looks honest, we tend to trust them. The third bias is called the demeanor bias. This is the tendency to judge senders' communication styles as credible, irrespective of their actual truthfulness. In their review, Bond and DiPaolo differentiate sender detectability or transparency from sender credibility. Senders are perfectly detectable if they are always judged to be lying when telling a lie, and always judged to be truthful when telling the truth. Senders are perfectly credible if they are invariably perceived to be truthful, whether lying or telling the truth. We don't really know what makes someone more or less transparent. There are probably a number of factors, including the person's ethical reaction to lying and even their acting ability. Some people just look more honest to us than other people, but that's a result of our biases more than anything they might be doing. The expectancy violations bias is the tendency to judge unusual behavior as deceptive. If someone deviates from a norm or just looks fishy, we assume they must be lying. Burgoon's expectancy violations theory postulates that deviations from normative behaviors are arousing and divert attention to the unexpected act. While it's common practice to try and find out a baseline for someone's normal, truthful behavior and examine deviations from the baseline, it might work against us if we see any deviation as evidence of a lie. People can deviate from their norm for a variety of reasons, including nervousness. When we know someone well, they can also use their own baseline to improve their lies because they know what their normal behavior looks like too. We have to be especially careful not to judge any difference from what we expect in terms of cultural norms as deceptive as well. In some cultures, it's disrespectful to look authority figures in the eye, so if we use eye contact as an indicator and use our own cultural norms as the standard, we'll be way off. The fifth bias is what we call the confirmation bias. It's the tendency to search for or interpret information in a way that confirms one's preconceived biases, expectations, or hypotheses. For example, if you think your partner's cheating on you and he or she denies it when you confront them about it, then you start looking for evidence that they're lying and overlook evidence that they're telling the truth because it's contrary to your hypothesis. Whatever your hypothesis is when you start serves as a basis from which you determine guilt. All of us are susceptible to confirmation bias, but we're especially vulnerable to this bias when we're highly invested in our original hypothesis. Thinking of alternative hypotheses or playing devil's advocate to consider reasons why you might be wrong can help overcome this bias. For example, O'Brien's study of confirmation bias in criminal investigations demonstrated that participants who considered why their hypothesis might be wrong showed less bias, but those who generated several additional hypotheses did not, suggesting that too many alternatives or the task complexity can hinder one's systematic processing ability. My research team here at the University of Oklahoma, along with our partners in the K-20 Center and the University of Arizona, built and tested a video game that was meant to reduce confirmation bias. We found that teaching people about the bias and showing them ways to counteract it in the game was successful at reducing the bias. The sixth bias is called representativeness bias. Tversky and Kahneman said that representativeness bias is the tendency to judge the probability of a hypothesis by considering how the hypothesis resembles available data. Heuristics simplify the process of assessing probabilities, and we tend to replace more reliable methods of calculating potential outcomes, which leads to decision-making errors. These decision-making deficits include insensitivity to prior probabilities of outcomes, also known as the base rate fallacy. If we have insensitivity to sample size, misperceptions of chance, and stereotyping, these are also examples of representativeness bias. For example, if you have a relationship with someone who's lied to you in the past, you might try to estimate the probability that they're telling the truth now based on that past data. However, each new truth-deception judgment is really a new 50-50 chance and shouldn't be affected by your past judgments. If you flip a coin 10 times and it comes up heads every time, does that mean you're due for a tails? No, that's called the gambler's fallacy and is a type of representativeness bias. Use your knowledge of the person and the situation and try to think systematically rather than relying on heuristics like this. We have discussed 6 different types of bias that interfere with your ability to assess credibility and detect deception accurately. The heuristic systematic model offers you an alternative to heuristics and biases. That means thinking systematically, considering the evidence, knowing the situation, and looking for patterns of behavior rather than zeroing in on 1 or 2 cues, especially the visual ones that aren't very reliable. Good luck.